This is the PR Podcast, a show about how public relations helps you tell your story to the world. We talk with great PR practitioners who have the skills, creativity, and just plain savvy to get their clients noticed. Now here's your host, Jody Fisher.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the PR Podcast. I'm Jody Fisher. Thanks for joining us. Well, have you got yourself your PR podcast plug yet? I frequently say that PR people are great at promoting our clients, terrible at promoting ourselves, and present company included. I am just awful at promoting myself, even with the new agency and the fact that I've got to be out there promoting myself. So the PR podcast plug was designed to thread that needle. If you're doing something that's super cool, it's not your 9-to-5 job. It's something else that you do. Maybe it's your newsletter. Maybe it's your social media feed. Maybe it's an interview you had, an award you won. We want to plug you here on the show. So send us your PR podcast plug to jody@jodyfisherpr.com, or just reach out to us on one of our social media channels at the PR Podcast. Let us know that cool thing that you're doing so we can share it with the audience and we can give you the congratulations that you rightfully deserve. Now, on with our show today, we have a terrific guest. Nathan Miller is the CEO and founder of Miller Inc., a full-service, award-winning strategic and crisis communications firm based in Los Angeles. He's helped hundreds of organizations tell their stories better and navigate the complex issues and crises around the globe. Before founding Miller Inc. in 2013, Nathan was the Director of Speechwriting for Israel's permanent mission to the United Nations, serving as a senior communications advisor and the chief speechwriter for Israel's UN ambassador. Nathan's been featured in Forbes and has been interviewed on CNN, NPR, and most recently on Canceled, the podcast, where he shared some of his crisis communications expertise. Now, Nathan, welcome to the PR Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Jody. It's great to be here.
Appreciate you being on. We hear a lot about crisis communications in our line of work. And there are some people like you who really focus on it. How did you get into crisis communications?
It's funny, it's not the kind of career that I necessarily thought about when I was in college or grad school. I got my master's in public policy and thought I was going to work in some way with the government. My first real crisis gig, I was at a smaller agency here in LA, and I was sort of low man on the totem pole at the agency. I'd been there for probably a year, in my early mid-20s, and there was a small matter out in the middle of the Mojave Desert in a little town called Boron, California. If you've ever, for those who are a little older, you maybe remember borax. It's like a soap detergent. Well, it turns out boron is the global, basically supplier of borates all around the world, and borates are used in all sorts of industrial processes. So there was this tiny mine that had been there since the 20s and produced like 80% of the world's borates, and it was a union mine, overseen by the ILW, which is a really tough, the longshoremen's union here in California. And they had discovered borates somewhere else in Turkey, and they were like eating this mine's lunch. And so these miners who had been out in boron for 80 years, and a lot of them were making $200,000-$300,000 a year to be at this mine in boron, and the company then was trying to change some of the work rules and some other things, and the ILW didn't like that, and they sort of got in a dispute. And we were one of several agencies that had been hired on this, to help manage this dispute. And it was a very small contract for our firm, so basically my boss just sent me out to the Mojave Desert, and I was out there for like 3-4 months. And increasingly we went from this kind of smallest agency on the job to the main agency running the whole thing. And I was actually running the whole thing at a very young age, and I loved it. And I'd wake up every morning, and we were managing, hundreds of international media inquiries. I was, traveling around in armored cars with the owners of the mine to TV interviews, and dealing with all sorts of, at that time, which is years ago now, big print ads and all the local papers and press conferences and things like that. And I found that I really enjoyed that work. I describe it now as athletic. You have to think on your feet. You have to be really, you have to be decisive, but also strategic, and you make decisions based on probabilities and risk. and it was a lot of things that just I sort of really I gravitated towards. And so I did that for about a year, that crazy dispute. And then in the, sort of towards the end of my time with that agency, previous to working there, I'd worked in Europe at a think tank working on EU Middle East policy. And I'd always wanted to do sort of some work in international relations. And I got an opportunity to become the chief speechwriter communications director for Israel's mission to the UN. For anybody who knows the dynamics at the United Nations, you know that Israel is not exactly the most popular country at the UN. And every day is a crisis for Israel at the UN. And, I had a lot of crazy things. And I was 25, 26 at the time when I took that job. So it was, the US the speechwriter of the US mission was like 45 and had been the former, editor of the Wall Street Journal's ed page. And, it was just huge differential. I was very young to have that job. And I had a staff of me and one other person when I started. And it was and we were the focus of a lot of international media. So I was thrown into that work very early, and I navigated a lot of different crises over my time at Israel's mission to the UN. It was, when I was there, it was the outbreak of the Arab Spring, dealt with Iran sanctions, the Palestinian UN statehood bid, and a lot of other crazy things. I was telling someone about this recently. Harvey Weinstein produced a movie about a Palestinian PLO terrorist that he premiered at the GA as a media stunt, and sort of navigated that among other, many different situations. So I got I got good at this work. I did a lot of it at a pretty early age, and then over the last decade, we've built one of the leading crisis comms agencies, certainly on the West Coast, and we have work that is here in California, but also national and global in scope. And as the field has evolved, and it really has over the last decade quite substantially, we've really evolved with it, and we've learned to bring different tools and techniques to the table to help people design crisis comm strategies tailored to this moment, and not legacy strategies that I think are too often deployed in the market today. So that's been really fun.
It is a huge, I guess, industry within our industry, right? Crisis communications. It's certainly a huge discipline. And crisis can strike really at any moment, and it can take multiple forms. What defines a crisis for you in terms of, and we're sticking with, a PR crisis, but what determines or what defines crisis?
Generally, there's some time-bound element in it where if you don't act fairly quickly, at least in crisis response, if you don't act quickly, something will move in a direction that might not be necessarily in the best interest of the client. You have to make some quick decisions. Crisis prep can be proactive, and we do a lot of crisis management, crisis planning, which is a different thing. That's anticipating what could happen that could have reputational consequences for you, and thinking through all the different scenarios and then building out a plan. But crisis response is, what you do in that moment, making decisions quickly and acting quickly in order to prevent reputational damage or other events that may undermine the goals of an organization or an individual.
Yeah, it's great to hear you explain it in that way, because I've heard others talk about, and it sounds like you would subscribe to this too, that a crisis is basically anything that takes you off your regular path. Yeah. It's anything that sort of throws a hard right or a left on you and takes you away from what you do in your regular business.
Yep.
I've also got to imagine that for the years that you've been doing this, you've seen the way you respond to crisis evolve, specifically with not just the news cycles getting shorter, but also the integration of social media, both in what you're responding to, sort of like almost sub-crises inside of the crisis, as well as how you're able to respond utilizing social media. How do you go about that?
We think about several major shifts in the landscape. When I started in the mid, I've been in this business, I would say almost 20 years now, but when it's almost unrecognizable from when I started. journalism has shifted seismically. There's fewer reporters and in some ways more outlets, and fewer outlets that have influence. And so that's one huge change. The sort of mid-tier, a story in the LA Times today probably will carry less, have less influence than a really strong piece of social media. But it's crazy, but I've seen it in practice where that was definitely not true 10, 15 years ago. There's fewer reporters to cover some of the longer tail beats. That's one major shift. The second shift is the lines between advertorial and editorial are increasingly blurred, and understanding sort of what's pay to play and what's a real journalism. People, the public has less recognition of that, and often our clients do, and that can be weaponized against people in a really profound way. And if you don't understand what you're facing, if you just treat it like a normal reporter engagement, when you don't understand what's actually behind an outlet, and what even is what's a real journalistic outlet and what is just an advocacy site, that's challenging. And so being able to identify that and deal within that context is really important. And then the final piece is everyone is a publisher, and it's not just social media, but it's the ability to directly engage with an audience is extremely powerful. And if you're a good storyteller and you can directly engage with an audience, the mediators of communication, traditionally the media, you can reach your audience around them, and you can have an unadulterated message, and so can your opponent. So when you're in a dispute, or there's some issue where someone's trying to spread a certain narrative about you, you have to really be adept at navigating in those three ways. That's really important. So we try to understand that, bring a comprehensive view to it, and help people recognize. I often joke that we specialize in weird cases. We get a lot of referrals from other PR firms where they see something and they just don't know how to deal with it. Whether it's somebody who's dealing with a hack and leak, or there's a foreign espionage operation that's targeting a certain company, or a business dispute where they're using so much of what we see today is fake online. And we're very adept at understanding that, identifying what's real, what's fake, and shutting down fake things and using it against opponents as necessary. And it's a really evolving and complicated field, but I think really important to understand that for folks. And it's not just at the highest levels, it's at every level of the PR business, really. So it's super interesting.
It's great to hear you describe it. Great. I use the word great, right? It's interesting. Crisis is never really great, but it's interesting to hear you describe it in that way. And hear you put the emphasis on social media, both in how it can be, it can drive crisis, but it can also be used to respond to crisis. And to your point about, the LA Times, to use your example, carrying potentially less weight than something that's really well crafted or something takes a life of its own on social media. I got to imagine that you're almost paying more attention maybe to what's going on social media, because it's not just the main actors that are involved, but it's all the ancillary characters who are around and chiming in. And then you've got, just sort of like the window shoppers, or the people in the cheap seats who are lobbing in, tweets and things like that, right?
I would say yes and no. So on the one hand, you want to hear it, pay attention to it, have awareness of what's going on, but then you have to separate sort of the noise on social media from from who your real target audience is. It's now kind of a truism that Twitter isn't real life. But sometimes when you're in a crisis, a client will be so focused on what the comment section is saying, or what's going on social, that it's hard for them to disaggregate those handful. Sometimes it can be a small group of people, or we've seen a lot of fake campaigns too, where a competitor is invested in creating fake narrative on social, or someone who's disgruntled, or whatever it is. So being able to separate what's real, and from what's not as important. And I go back every time, and the core of every good strategic comms strategy, and it's particularly true for crisis, is defining what is your objective, a clear, specific, measurable objective. Who is your audience, a clearly targeted audience, and what is your message? And your message should align your audience with your objective. And so often in a crisis situation, the client, is they just want to do something and they get very tactical and they respond. But I always try to reorient them back to those three core pillars. What is our ultimate goal here? What are we trying to achieve? Who do we really care about reaching? Is it those 5 people on Twitter, or is it your shareholders or your customers or whoever it is? And what is the message that's going to drive your audience in the direction of your objective? And that's super important. And the Mike Tyson line, everybody has a plan until you get punched in the face, is really true when it comes to crisis, where people they get very disoriented. And so part of our job as a strategist and as a counselor to them is helping to reorient them around that objective audience message.
Great point. And to call out too that clients typically, whenever they're faced with crisis or something that's adversarial or just something that they don't like, come to people like us, and they think that we have a magic button and they want to push it and they want to get back to normal. Just go and fix it. Just make it all go away. And you and I and many of the people who are listening to this right now know that there is no just fix it button, that there is a way to get to fix it, but it's a process and it's a path. How do you walk people along that path? How do you orient?
I like speaking. So I'm a very straight talking guy. My style as a strategist is to be I don't sugarcoat too much. I'm pretty honest and straightforward about how I see a situation. I like to speak in probabilities from my perspective, because you can't give people certainty. They'll say, well, if I do this, will X happen? I'll say, I can't tell you that for sure. I think there's probably a 60-70% chance that if we do this, this will happen. And there's a 20 or 30% chance that this will happen. Because you don't have a crystal ball, and you're always weighing things, and you want to, ultimately it's the client's right to decide how they respond. You say, this is my advice. Here is why I suggest this. Here I think are the potential outcomes if we do these things, based on my past experience and how I see it. And then it's on them to make the decision. And when people come in and just say, let me just fix it, I'm going to make a bunch of decisions without your input, I think it's setting. If it goes well, then it's great and you're a magician and whatever. But if it goes badly, which is always possible, the client didn't have the opportunity to really understand that was a possibility. And for me, the important thing during a crisis is to have really clear communication with the client. So I understand what their real goals are. Sometimes people won't tell you what they really like, what the worst outcome for them and what the best outcome would be. It's not always evident at first, after that first conversation. You have to really communicate. And sometimes when I speak in probabilities and I say, there's a 20% chance that this will happen, when they hear that, they say, oh, I can't risk that. We have to think about a different path here. So it's important to communicate and have an understanding on the front end before you make any decision where things may go. And I think people respect that. When you say I don't know, it doesn't signal that you have a lack of knowledge. It's just honesty. And I think most people, even in their moment of crisis, when they're hysterical and upset, when they feel that you're being straightforward and you have expertise, but your expertise only takes you so far in terms of predicting the future, I think most of the time is that they're pretty understanding and responsive, and they appreciate honesty, and they don't want someone to just sweet talk them and make them feel better, but not give them really clear-eyed advice.
That's a great perspective. And I got to agree with that, because I don't do crisis to the degree that you do. But when I am faced with, a crisis situation, or at least advising a client about, how to approach something that's, slightly on the negative side, I'll typically take the path of saying, okay, if we do this, then this is likely to happen. If we do that, that is likely to happen. Here's how we can get to your goal if we do this, and then we do this, and then we do that. And sort of giving them, like you said, sort of giving them multiple roadmaps and let them decide what they feel most comfortable with. And being clear with them that, if you do that thing, it's likely to go in the direction you think it's going, and here's why.
Yep, absolutely.
Almost being a meteorologist in a way.
That's kind of all you can do.
We think it's going to rain.
Yeah. Super important.
So part and parcel of crisis is storytelling, right? And going back to the sort of the nature of what we do as PR people, being storytellers, especially on the positive side of the coin. What goes into telling that story in the context of crisis, telling that positive story, or maybe telling that story that can help to repair a situation or resuscitate a reputation?
Well, I totally agree with you, by the way. Since humans were, living in caves without enough to eat, we've been painting on walls to tell stories. I think storytelling is an innate need as humans. And it's something that we connect to, that we absolutely need. And it's one of the most powerful tools that we have as humans to influence other humans, is the ability to tell a story. I go back to Aristotle. I maybe this shows like I'm pretty old school on this, but I think about ethos, pathos, and logos, which you probably heard before. But the notion of a great story kind of incorporates all three. Ethos meaning establishing the credibility of the speaker. Why are you someone you should listen to, especially during crisis? That's something you have to think about. What do you have credibility to actually effectively speak about, and not just seem like you're being, inauthentic or easily, self-interested. Pathos, what's the emotional appeal that you're delivering? And then logos, what's the rational appeal? How does X plus, A plus B equals C, and why is that? That's at a high level, like the framework that I think about. It's a framework I thought a lot about as a speechwriter. In our normal strategic comms work that we're doing with clients. We don't just do crisis, by the way. Our firm we have several other business units, but in crisis, the same rules apply. How are we touching people's emotions? How are we touching their head? And how are we making them believe that we have the credibility to speak? And then the other thing that I'll just say, two quick things on with crisis storytelling. One is authenticity is everything. If you don't come off as authentic, if you come off as sort of self-serving, which so many corporate comm shops make this mistake, I see again and again, where it's just clearly corporate speak and it doesn't feel authentic, and people just it doesn't buy them anything. And don't lie. That's something that we often say the cover up is worse than the crime when it comes to crisis, and I see people try to lie for short-term gain, but most of the time it doesn't work. When you lie, it comes out. Don't lie to journalists, don't lie to employees, don't lie to your stakeholders, don't lie to your PR counselors, because all of those things won't help you long term. And it's a really important thing. And there's a human inclination to try to make the short-term pain go away. And you can do that sometimes with little half-truths or lies. And I really push people to tell the truth. I think it's not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do.
100% there. Agreed with you. Yeah. My old boss, Howard Rubenstein, used to have that Mark Twain quote on his desk saying, if you tell the truth, if you always tell the truth, you don't have to remember anything.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, and the cover up is always worse than the crime, always worse. I saw that, 25 years ago when I was working for a particular client. And there was someone who had done something bad and then literally tried to cover it up. And, this was a criminal investigation, and he got in more trouble for the cover up than he did for the actual crime, which could have been easily described as an accident, right? A horrible one at that, but an accident. And it ended up, dude went to jail and the whole 9 yards. I mean, it was just, it was bad news, and was mostly built around the cover up.
It's not always, but it's almost always the problem. I have a note, I've been doing this long enough that if a certain client, you can kind of smell it on the front end. If you just don't really believe it, I usually will pass on those cases, because I don't want to go to bat as an advocate for someone who I think is just, blatantly lying to me and to the public. It's no good for us. And, and that's a really big, I think that's a piece of advice I have for PR folks, is be careful who you go into business with. And, because at the end of the day, what we do serve in a different role. We're more like, we're advocates, and just like an attorney, doesn't necessarily reflect always who their clients are, but there's a certain line that you have to be really careful about. And having a very, loose relationship with the truth is one that I think is problematic for everybody.
We agree strongly on that point. Absolutely. Let's pivot a little bit, but stay on storytelling here, and pivot a little bit into your speech writing background.
Sure.
I've done a little bit of speech writing in my, career. I've found it to be one of the most rewarding assignments, because you are helping someone articulate in a long form what is on their mind, or speak, really get an emotional reaction from a particular audience. Tell us a little bit about your approach to speech writing, and how you help people convey what may sometimes be complex ideas.
Yeah, I love speech writing and speech writers. I think they're some of the most thoughtful, intelligent, interesting group of folks. When I lived in New York, I was part of, there's a speechwriters guild in New York, and they would have these lunches, and it was super fun. And people who were doing corporate work, working for politicians, the UN, whatever. And I always just really enjoyed the community of those folks. And a lot of people who I encounter who I think are the most talented in our business had some sort of speech writing background. Because it's not just about being a good writer. You can be a great writer and a terrible speechwriter. You have to be a really good writer and a really good psychologist and a really good, sort of have an understanding of showmanship and the relationship between a speaker and the audience. You have to be a psychologist in the sense that you have to understand what someone wants to say and what they don't want to say. What they don't want to say is more important than what they do want to say. And we have a writing shop within my agency, and a number of writers, and we have some speech writing clients. And when I work with our writers, I always say, you have to picture yourself in the client's skin, standing at the podium. What's the audience? Who's the audience going to be? Like, how is that line going to land? How is our client going to sound saying that line? And you have to tailor the suit specific to all of those circumstances. And you have to really kind of be able to, it's almost like, an augmented reality. You have to really have a sense of that, how it's going to land. And the only way to do that is to do it for years. When I was the speechwriter at the UN mission, I was writing 20 speeches a week sometimes. And, for that kind of volume, you just sort of, your brain begins to quickly intuit certain things, and there's circuits that happen. And I think you write enough speeches for enough different people, and you sort of understand intuitively how they're going to be able to communicate with a certain audience. It's a very labor-intensive job. It takes it's great mental labor. But I read a lot of books. There's William Safire's book, Lend Me Your Ears. I highly recommend it to everybody who's. I sat with it by my bed. It's about 2,000 pages, and he's one of my favorite speechwriters. But he has every speech from Cicero to the late 20th century, and he does a little introduction before every speech and talks about why it's good or why it's interesting. And I got through that book. I would just read a couple speeches before I went to bed, and it was just a really good way of learning. And there's James Humes has a book on Churchill's method of speaking, which I really like. He was an LBJ speechwriter. If I ever write, when I left my job at the UN, one of the things I wanted to write was the greatest Jewish speeches in history. I think it's a book that should be written. And I even had an agent, and I have a half-written book that I've never quite finished because of just life's got in the way. But at some point, that I will write that book, because I think there's been a lot of great Jewish speeches in history, and a lot of events in Jewish history have been influenced by speeches. And so that's something I always thought about, and I really love. I love speech writing as a craft.
It does sound like a great idea for a book. The challenge that I've always had when I've written, the limited number compared to you, the limited number of speeches that I've written, they're a different animal, like you said, but they can also be very challenging because, like you said, you have to get inside the skin of the person who you're writing for. And as much as, or as good as you think you might be, or as accurately as you might write, there's still the possibility that they're going to deliver it in a different cadence than the one you had in your head. Yep. How do you get around that? Do you write the speech and then sit with them and walk them through it? What happens? What's the process?
As much as possible, you have to write it for them. If you have to do a lot of extra work to get them on your page, I think it's mostly going to be challenging. We've advised a few political candidates here and there, and sometimes, I've written speeches for them, and in that circumstance, I think it becomes more like, no, you have to do it this way because this is your profession, and But if you're writing for a CEO or a nonprofit leader or whatever, or an individual, like most of the time, they're not going to be professional speakers, and you just have to try to make it as smooth and easy for them, in my experience, as you can. And you have to listen. Generally, the first speech, you're not going to get perfect. You want to write the speech, hear how they did, listen to it, reflect back and say, okay, they don't do well with long sentences with gerunds. So we have to really make sure that these are shorter sentences with simpler, shorter words, or they speak really, really fast. And that's something where you maybe give them a note, but you also try to like frame up the text so that it gives them, you write in, pause for applause, pause and take a breath. I do all of those kinds of techniques to try to, be an aid to the speaker as they're getting up there and speaking. But every single person is different, and you have to be very flexible as a speechwriter to sort of work with whoever the client is to understand what's going to make it easier for them, because it's, for most people, public speaking is one of the most stressful things they do. They hate it, and so your job is to make it easier and less stressful and feel more natural and comfortable, because if you have a more confident, comfortable person, standing at the podium, they're going to just give a better speech. And that's more important, frankly, than almost anything you're going to write for them.
And so now circling back to where we started with crisis communications and sort of getting to the intersection of that, and let's just call it public speaking, whether or not it's speech writing, but public speaking, there they are at the podium in the middle of the crisis, giving the, what we've advised as the necessary press conference interview, or even just the one-on-one. How do you combine the two, the sort of the message that you put in the speech or the speech writing or the public remarks, and the attention to crisis and strategy and how you execute that? Are there overlaps there?
Yeah, no, certainly. I mean, I think it all goes back to what I said before, that audience, the objective audience message. A good speech is reaching the right audience and driving, and delivering a message that's going to move your audience in the direction of your objective. That's what we orient everything around. We do a lot of training around that in our agency, is helping people be what we call it strategic communications for a reason. Everything is embedded in strategy. It's hard for people when they're first starting their careers sometimes to understand that, or even coming from journalism, where the goal is ostensibly, if you're a good journalist, is to deliver the truth. That's not really our goal as PR people. Our goal is to help drive forward an objective for folks, and putting on that strategic thinking cap. It's not something that is necessarily intuitive, and it takes a lot of like reorienting your brain around, how this business can work, no matter whether you're, doing PR around a consumer product, or representing a celebrity, or, helping a corporation navigate a crisis, or writing a speech for a politician. It's that same framework, I think, and really good folks in this business understand that, and can have it sort of intuitively hardwired into them. Unfortunately, too many folks are running around and calling those PR professionals who don't understand that, and they're very tactical, and they know how to push a button, but they don't know how to stop and take the time to think. What's the objective? Who's the audience? What's the message? And and the folks who get paid the big bucks are the ones who can really understand that strategic framework.
That is a terrific framework on how to think about it. I think we should make T-shirts, frankly.
I have mugs here. I have a lot of my team made me mugs for my birthday last year, and one says "Don't bury the lead," and the other one says "Objective audience message." So I'm like a broken record around here about certain simple things, but that's one of them.
When it works, right?
Right.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a great conversation, Nathan. Thank you so much for sharing all this. We are going to segue now into the rapid fire question portion of our podcast. This is where we steal a page from inside the actor studio, ask our guests a series of rapid fire questions meant to elicit a simple answer, maybe a laugh or two. And we want to get some Los Angeles flavor out of these, Nathan. So, give us the West Coast version here. With your indulgence, here we go. Rapid fire question number 1 for Nathan Miller. What is your favorite news source?
So traditionally, I would say for hard news, Wall Street Journal, But I am going to give you Puck because I really like what those guys are doing, and I've been reading it pretty religiously, and it's a great new little channel.
That's a great one. Absolutely. Rapid fire question number 2. What's your favorite social media platform?
LinkedIn, without a doubt.
What do you use LinkedIn for? How do you use it?
It's the only one. I think Facebook is just, it's become weird. I don't know. And we use LinkedIn as a recruitment tool to communicate with colleagues. It's just professional and clean. And it's sort of, I'm not a big Insta, guy. I do social for our job, but for me, I find LinkedIn to be by far and away the most useful.
Yeah, I agree with you on the professional part. I just wish they would get rid of the congratulate them on their birthday automated things that they have.
Oh, yeah.
They have a couple of those automated response. Like, I don't need people to wish me happy birthday.
Yeah, I agree.
LinkedIn.
I agree. I just find useful things on there. I get the weirdest sort of suggestions now. I don't know. The algorithm on a lot of the other platforms have gotten kind of crazy, and so not for me.
We could do a whole show on the algorithms.
Yeah,
Back to the questions. Rapid fire number 3, coffee or alcohol?
No question, coffee. I'm a big coffee guy. I have a really nice Spaziale Italian espresso machine in our house, and we have another espresso machine in the office. Big coffee guy, no question.
Oh, I'm jealous. Rapid fire question number 4. What's your favorite on the run food?
Dried mango. My go-to. I like dried mango. It's delicious. We get those big bags in my house, and that's an on-the-run food I could totally take. Yep.
Nice. I like the sound of that. Rapid fire question number 5. What do you want to be after you finish this career?
I think I want to write the speechwriting book and maybe a few others, but I think I got a couple more decades in this career at least. So, hoping. Well,
they say we all have a book in us. I don't think I do, but it sounds like you definitely do. So we'll look forward to getting that one.
Hitchens said everyone has a book in them. It's just some that shouldn't come out. So, so maybe I don't know which category I fall in, but I like that quote.
Leave it to Hitchens, right? Well,
Yeah.
Nathan, this has been a great conversation. Please let people know how they can find you and Miller Inc. online.
Great. So we're at Miller Inc. with a K, MILLERINK.com. My email, Nathan@Miller-Inc. with a K.com. And then we're on social. If you go Miller Inc. we're on LinkedIn, Facebook, Insta, all those places. You can find a Miller Inc. agency. So really great to be here, Jody. Appreciate you having me on the show. Congrats on what's a really awesome podcast. I've listened to a lot of others, and you've had some really great guests and insights, and really fun to join you today.
Well, I really appreciate it, and we're glad to add you to the roster of guests there. Thank you, Nathan, and thank you, everyone, for listening. Please remember to subscribe to the show, connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at The PR Podcast, and send us a question or a comment. Our intro is by Christopher Appold. You can find him and his fantastic photography on Instagram at Christopher_APPOLDT. Check him out there and hire him for all your photography needs. You can find me online at Jody Fisher on all the socials and on the web at jodyfisherpr.com. We'll see you next time on the PR Podcast.